In the first book of the Bible, known as Genesis, the Almighty instructs Noah to build a rectangular ark. Over the centuries, artistic depictions of this biblical vessel have undergone significant transformations. Artists have imagined it in various ways, from a majestic ship, as seen in a 19th century painting, to a whimsical box on stilts preserved in a mosaic from an ancient synagogue in southeastern Turkey. There are also more modern and playful interpretations, such as the cartoonish depiction on the cover of the video game Super 3D Noah's Ark for the Super Nintendo console. However, it is important to note that ancient Mesopotamian flood myths predate the book of Genesis and describe an ark of an entirely different shape. In 2014, Assyriologist Irving Finkel translated a text found on the so-called Ark Tablet, an ancient Babylonian cuneiform tablet dated to approximately 1900 to 1700 BCE. This text recounts the familiar story of a great flood and a man who builds a massive vessel to save life. One need not be an expert in Assyriology to notice the striking similarities between this narrative and the biblical account of Noah's Ark. Nevertheless, this story was written in Akkadian, not Hebrew. Its protagonist is Atrahasis, not Noah, and his boat is circular, not rectangular. Dr. Finkel hypothesized that this early version of the ark was modeled after a real watercraft, a round boat known as a coracle, essentially a large floating basket woven from coiled reeds. Coracles were used by ancient Mesopotamians to navigate the marshy waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Scholars have long recognized that the Genesis flood story has roots in earlier traditions, such as the Epic of Atrahasis. Beyond the shape of the ark, what are the key differences between these narratives? What changes did the ancient biblical authors introduce in the story of Noah's flood? Understanding which elements biblical writers preserved, altered, or discarded can offer us fresh insight into this familiar tale and its cultural context. We will examine 4 versions of the Mesopotamian flood myth in approximate chronological order: the Sumerian flood story, the Epic of Atrahasis, already mentioned, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and, of course, the story of Noah in the book of Genesis. Other versions also exist, for instance, a Greek account of the flood written by a 3rd century BCE Babylonian priest named Berosus, preserved only in fragments. There is also a highly fragmentary Syrian version discovered in the ancient city of Ugarit. But if this seems overwhelming, don't worry. We will focus exclusively today on the book of Genesis and the earlier stories that preceded it. The oldest known version of the Mesopotamian flood myth is the so-called Sumerian flood story, dated to the 2nd millennium BCE. It is extremely fragmentary and survives on a clay tablet housed in the Penn Museum of Archaeology in Philadelphia. Recent literary studies trace the origin of the story to around 1900 BCE, though the tablet itself dates to approximately 1600 BCE. The hero of the tale is named Ziusudra, meaning roughly, he of long life. According to the narrative, Ziusudra was king of the Sumerian city of Shuruppak and a priest of the god Enki, who, as we shall see, plays a crucial salvific role in these stories. Only the bottom third of the tablet has survived, so many plot details are missing. Nevertheless, the story begins with the creation of humankind and the founding of the first cities. After this, a large section is lost, but it appears that the gods, led by Enlil, conspire to destroy humanity with a flood. However, the god Enki goes to Ziusudra and warns him. It has been decided to destroy the seed of humankind. The verdict, the word of the divine assembly, cannot be revoked. Another gap follows, but presumably Enki instructs Ziusudra how to build a boat to survive the deluge, because the narrative resumes with the flood tossing a great vessel. After the flood had swept over the land for 7 days and 7 nights, and the destructive wind rocked the great boat in the high waters, the sun appeared, illuminating heaven and earth. Ziusudra opened a window in the great boat, and the sun god's rays entered the great boat. The story concludes with Ziusudra disembarking with many animals he saved, and Enlil granting him immortality, apparently having changed his mind after just trying to annihilate humanity. Next comes the epic of Atrahasis, already mentioned in the introduction. It survives in several Akkadian versions, including the Ark tablet, but the most famous copy is a 3-tablet cycle from southern Mesopotamia dated to the 1600s BCE. The story is named after its hero, Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise. Like Ziusudra, he is portrayed as a servant of the god Enki. The Epic of Atrahasis also begins with the creation of humankind and a divine plot to destroy them with a flood, once again with Enlil as the antagonist and Enki as the savior. According to the tale, humanity multiplies and becomes so noisy that it disturbs Enlil's sleep. The noise of humankind has become too loud for me. Because of their clamor, I am deprived of sleep. To get some rest, Enlil decides to wipe them all out, a response that, to modern ears, sounds wildly disproportionate. First, he sends a plague, then withholds rain to starve humanity. But Enki thwarts him both times. Finally, Enlil resolves to send a flood, so Enki warns Atrahasis in a dream and instructs him to build a large boat and load it with all the animals. In one version, this dream comes to Atrahasis after he spends the night in the god's temple. Atrahasis, heed my advice so you may live forever. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions, and save your life. As in the Sumerian version, the flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The story ends with Atrahasis offering a sacrifice to the gods. The third tradition recounting the Great Flood appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The most complete version of this legend is considerably later than the earlier texts and is preserved on the so-called Flood Tablet, part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, dated to around the 600s BCE. This tablet was created roughly 1,000 years after the Atrahasis tablet, though other fragments of the Gilgamesh epic, dating to as early as 1200 BCE, have also been found. Thus, despite the artifact's 600 BCE date, the story itself reaches far deeper into antiquity. Although the Epic of Gilgamesh primarily concerns the demigod king Gilgamesh, its 11th tablet contains a flood narrative told by the hero Utnapishtim, whose name, he who found life, is roughly the Akkadian translation of the Sumerian Ziusudra. Like Ziusudra, Utnapishtim is king of Shuruppak and depicted as a servant of the god Ea, the Babylonian counterpart of Enki. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the reason for the flood is initially unclear, but by the end we learn that Enlil decided to send the flood as a form of thinning, to reduce human population, though not necessarily to eradicate it entirely. As in other versions, Ea warns the hero to build an ark. This scene nearly quotes the Atrahasis epic verbatim. O man of Shuruppak, tear down your house, build a boat, forsake wealth and seek life. Abandon possessions and save your life. Bring aboard the boat the seed of all living creatures. This near-verbatim borrowing shows that the Gilgamesh flood story draws directly from Atrahasis. Indeed, the Gilgamesh account even retains the name Atrahasis in one passage where the author failed to update it. The flood subsides on the 7th day, and the narrative concludes with the ark landing on Mount Nisir, Utnapishtim releasing birds to find dry land and offering a sacrifice. Elements strikingly familiar to readers of the Bible. Following this chronological sequence, we finally arrive at Noah in the book of Genesis, which exhibits remarkable parallels with the Epic of Gilgamesh, both in broad narrative structure and finer details. This version of the flood myth, found in Genesis, is dated to approximately the 5th century BCE. The Genesis flood story is generally understood by biblical scholars as a compilation of at least 2 earlier sources woven together, what scholars often call the J and P sources, the Yahwist and priestly versions, respectively. The J source is traditionally considered the older. Both J and P in Genesis begin with the creation of humans and animals. But J more closely follows Mesopotamian traditions, where God forms the first human from clay. Like the Sumerian story, J also includes the founding of the first cities. Then, God resolves to destroy humanity with a flood. According to the J source, human wickedness is the reason. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind on earth was great, and that every inclination of their hearts was only evil all the time. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and he is commanded to build an ark to survive the deluge. Unlike other versions where the flood lasts only a week, the Genesis flood continues for 40 days and 40 nights. Yet, like the Gilgamesh epic, it ends with the ark resting on mountains, Noah sending out birds to find dry land, and offering a sacrifice. Thus, we have 4 stories sharing the same core plot: a hero who survives a flood by building a boat. Yet they form a complex web of striking similarities and differences. There are 4 distinct heroes. 3 stories feature the same antagonist and savior, Enlil and Enki, respectively, while one presents a single god. All 4 versions include the rescue of animals from the flood. 2 of them, Gilgamesh and Genesis, feature the episode where the hero releases birds to find dry land. Clearly, the Mesopotamian flood story was a widespread tradition, continually reworked and retold by ancient Near Eastern cultures over centuries. Now let us delve deeper into these similarities and differences, beginning with the architectural and engineering feats described in all 4 accounts. The Ark. Unfortunately, the surviving copy of the Sumerian flood story lacks the section describing the Ark's construction, so we do not know its shape. It simply uses the Sumerian word translated as great boat. However, the tablets contain an interesting detail. After the rain stops, Ziusudra makes a window to let in light. Ziusudra then drilled an opening in the great boat, and the valiant Utu, the sun god, sent his light into the great boat. This window scene also appears in Gilgamesh, the Ugaritic flood story, and Genesis. In Gilgamesh, I opened the window and light fell on my face. In the Ugaritic version, take a wooden shovel and a copper axe and make a window on top. Release a bird, let it find you shore. And in Genesis 8, after 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out a raven. The details vary slightly, but the window scene appears to be a common narrative element in every version. Specific construction details of the legendary arks appear only in 3 ancient sources: the Epic of Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the biblical book of Genesis. In the Epic of Atrahasis, the deity Enki instructs Atrahasis to build a circular vessel, specifying equal length and width. This ark, woven from reeds, had multiple decks with compartments and a roof, waterproofed with bitumen, a natural petroleum product of Mesopotamia long used for this purpose. Essentially, it was a giant coracle, a round boat that remained popular among riverine peoples throughout history. Coracles were used in Iraq until quite recently, as evidenced by historical photographs of kufas, coracle-like boats of southern Iraq. Neo-Assyrian reliefs depict such boats manned by several people, and Herodotus, the 5th century BCE Greek historian, mentioned seeing them in Babylonia, describing them as perfectly round vessels made of leather. Though these accounts are much later than the Atrahasis epic, Mesopotamians likely used coracles for millennia. Dr. Finkel suggests this boat type inspired the ark in Atrahasis and would have been readily understandable to its original audience. These boats were exceptionally buoyant, often made from coiled ropes or reeds and coated in bitumen. Despite potential difficulties in steering, this would not matter if the sole purpose was to ride out a storm, bobbing on the waves. Though Atrahasis's ark was fantastically large, coracles sometimes reached impressive sizes, from tiny one-person crafts to large ones capable of carrying several people or even livestock. Thus, the idea of transporting multiple people and animals would not have seemed especially strange to the original audience. The Epic of Gilgamesh, by contrast, describes a colossal, cube-shaped ark. The god Ea instructs Utnapishtim, "The boat you are to build, its dimensions must correspond, its width and length must be equal." Like Atrahasis, Gilgamesh describes a reed vessel with multiple decks, many compartments, and a roof. Like Ziusudra in the Sumerian story, Utnapishtim creates a window to admit sunlight after the rain ceases. The biblical account in Genesis also provides specific construction details, but describes a rectangular vessel. Like the others, it is coated in bitumen, and here the Hebrew text uses an Akkadian loanword, possibly inspired by Atrahasis or Gilgamesh. The Hebrew word used here, kofer, meaning bitumen, may derive from the Akkadian kupru. The chapter describing Noah's Ark is strange in several ways. It states the ark was made of gopher wood, an unknown species, probably not gophers. This, too, may be a loanword from Akkadian, related to kofer. The Hebrew word translated as ark, teba, also has uncertain meaning and origin. It appears only once elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, describing the floating reed basket in which the infant Moses is placed in Exodus. Dr. Finkel suggests teba might derive from tubu, a rectangular barge used for river crossings. Thus, despite the differing shapes, circular, cubic, and rectangular, the three arks exhibit striking similarities. All three vessels have nearly identical surface areas despite their dissimilar outlines. Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and Genesis all provide specific dimensions. The arks of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim each measured 14,400 square cubits, while Noah's Ark rounds this to 15,000 square cubits. All three stories emphasize the use of bitumen for waterproofing. All highlight the presence of a window, multiple decks, and compartments, and all describe the hero saving both domestic and wild animals aboard the ark. In Atrahasis, the god Enki sends animals to Atrahasis to await him as he loads the boat. Notably, it states the animals entered 2 by 2, a detail very familiar from Genesis. Atrahasis reads, "But the wild animals of the steppe entered the ark 2 by 2. Compare this with Genesis chapter 7, verse 8 and 9. "Of clean animals, and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 by 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah." As for the people aboard, Atrahasis includes the hero, his wife, his family, and several skilled workers. Gilgamesh, seemingly more concerned with preserving civilization, specifies that people of all trades and crafts should be taken aboard. In Genesis, only Noah and his immediate family are allowed on the ark. All others are left behind. The release of birds is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the dependence of the biblical flood narrative on earlier traditions. In Gilgamesh, after the storm subsides, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. When the raven does not return, he knows it is safe to leave the ark. In the Ugaritic fragment, a dove and a crane are released. In Genesis, Noah sends out a raven, and when it does not return, he releases a dove 3 times. Notably, Noah's raven, like Utnapishtim's, does not return. However, an interesting feature of the Genesis account is that the dove brings back an olive leaf, a plant native to the Levant, but not to Mesopotamia. Thus, the Genesis flood story clearly draws on these earlier narratives and is most closely linked to the version found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Scholars suggest this cultural transmission likely occurred during the Babylonian exile in 587 BCE, when the Neo-Babylonian Empire invaded the Kingdom of Judah and deported part of its population to Mesopotamia. Significantly, it was likely the Judean elite and literate classes who were taken. Dr. Finkel proposes that these Judean scribes eventually learned cuneiform and directly encountered Babylonian stories in their original Akkadian. Yet these scribes were not passive recipients of the flood myth. They reworked these stories to suit a Judean audience and Judean religion. So far, we have focused on relatively superficial similarities and differences. Atrahasis's ark is round, Noah's ark is rectangular. Utnapishtim releases a raven, swallow, and dove. Noah releases only a raven and dove. Nothing earth-shattering. But there is one essential difference between Genesis and the other versions. A difference that fundamentally reshapes the story's moral and theological message. In Genesis, a single deity, Yahweh in the J source and Elohim in the P source, is responsible both for the decision to destroy humanity and for the counter-decision to save them. This introduces a fascinating contrast between Genesis and the other 3 versions regarding divine justice. The 3 earlier versions feature multiple gods, and with multiple deities come distinct divine characters who play different roles, most notably the villainous Enlil and the savior god Enki. This allows for critique of the gods, as some behave badly or act capriciously. In Atrahasis, Enlil sends the flood because humanity was too noisy and kept him from sleeping. One might think, is killing all humans really justified because you can't sleep? Isn't that capricious and cruel? And you wouldn't be alone in that judgment. The Atrahasis epic itself seems to agree. The gods are by no means portrayed positively for sending the flood. The creator goddess Nintu weeps as she watches her people die. She cried out, she poured out her feelings. The gods wept with her for the land. Other gods recognize they are witnessing outrageous injustice. We see this again at the end of Atrahasis, when Atrahasis offers a sacrifice. There's a satirical scene where the gods swarm around the sacrificial meat like flies, presumably because they were so hungry from the lack of offerings. The gods smelled the savor. They gathered like flies around the offering. After eating, the creator goddess rises and condemns the other gods. Those who foolishly brought on the flood and doomed the peoples to catastrophe. One version of Atrahasis even explicitly condemns Enlil. The gods decreed destruction, the evil deed that Enlil would do to humankind. A similar scene appears in Gilgamesh. There, the gods smell Utnapishtim's sacrifice and are pleased, but the creator goddess stands up and openly denounces Enlil. But let Enlil not come near the offering, for he foolishly brought on the flood and delivered my people to destruction. The sacrifice sparks a divine debate about the flood's injustice. Ea declares, "Henceforth, the gods must punish individuals for their own sins, not collectively." The flood stories in both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh thus function as theological critiques. As one scholar put it, a theological critique that shows the gods only endanger their own existence by destroying their human support base. These narratives grapple with themes of meaningless suffering, issues that continue to resonate with philosophers and theologians today. But these themes of theological critique and divine injustice are thoroughly reworked in Genesis because God is both the initiator of the flood and the agent of salvation. Since God cannot be a villain, Genesis focuses on human wickedness and the righteousness of Noah. Humanity is so evil that the God of Israel is justified in destroying them, and Noah is so righteous that he deserves to be saved. Scholar Christine Hayes suggests the Genesis authors sought to portray God not as capricious, but as acting according to clear standards of justice, making the flood a deserved punishment. Another fundamental difference lies in the narrative's attitude toward natural human population growth. In Gilgamesh and other Mesopotamian myths, the gods view human reproduction as an urgent problem requiring immediate action. But in Genesis, humans are commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. According to biblical scholar Thomas Romer, this emphasis represents a direct response to Babylonian myths. In Gilgamesh, the problem with the flood is its excessive radicalism. But even Ea does not dispute that limiting human growth is a worthy goal. After the flood, Ea tells Enlil, instead of sending a flood, let a lion rise up to destroy the human throng. Instead of a flood, let famine strike the land. Instead of a flood, let Era, god of plague, rise up to smite the land. Ea is more troubled by the disproportionate method than by the goal of population control itself. Dr. Romer argues that by shifting the focus to human wickedness, Genesis effectively offers a more ethical reinterpretation of the Babylonian story. Evil, not population growth, is the cause of divine wrath. Despite numerous differences, many versions of the Near Eastern flood myth share universal themes that ancient peoples found compelling, regardless of location or belief. Divine justice versus divine caprice, righteousness versus evil. And these themes may explain the story's remarkable endurance, as it was passed down through generations over hundreds of years.